At first, the change was easy to overlook. Trucks began appearing along routes that had once been defined more by memory than by maps. Their paths cutting across stretches of land where movement had historically been slower, negotiated, and deeply tied to seasonal rhythms. What had once required caravans, agreements, and time was now reduced to calibrated flows. Fuel, goods, labor, moving with a precision that suggested something more deliberate than simple development. The desert has always been a space of connection, though rarely in the way modern systems understand it. Long before borders hardened into lines, it functioned as a network of negotiated passage. Tribes, merchants, and states all participated in a quiet equilibrium, where influence was measured not only in control of land, but in the ability to guarantee movement across it. Power rested in the assurance that routes remained open, even when authority was diffuse. What is unfolding now follows a different logic. The routes themselves are no longer merely passages, but instruments.
They are being reshaped into something measurable, scalable, and ultimately controllable.
A road is no longer just a road. It becomes an artery, something that can be expanded, redirected, or constricted with intention. The shift is subtle in its early stages because it presents itself as efficiency. Goods arrive faster, distances feel shorter, coordination improves. But beneath this efficiency lies a deeper reconfiguration. Movement is being centralized. Where once access depended on a web of relationships, it now depends increasingly on a system designed from above. The desert, which resisted rigid control for centuries, begins to take on the characteristics of an engineered space. And with that, its political meaning changes. This is not the first time a landscape has been transformed in this way. History offers quiet parallels, though they rarely announce themselves at the beginning. Empires have often started by improving the flow of goods and people, by smoothing the friction that defined earlier systems. Roads were paved, ports were expanded, routes were secured. These developments were rarely framed as instruments of control. They were described as necessities, as progress, as inevitabilities, shaped by geography and trade. In time, however, the infrastructure itself began to dictate outcomes. Control over routes became control over economies, and control over economies began to influence political structures. The system, once built to facilitate movement, started to determine who could move and under what conditions. It is in this transition that the nature of power shifts, often without immediate recognition.
In the present case, the scale is difficult to ignore, though its implications remain understated. A project valued in the tens of billions suggests not only ambition, but intent.
It reflects a decision to concentrate flows through defined channels, to replace dispersed networks with integrated ones. The desert, once a space of distributed authority, is being rewritten as a corridor. At the surface, this appears as a logistical achievement. Efficiency improves, trade accelerates. The region positions itself as a critical link between continents. Yet, these outcomes are secondary to the structural transformation taking place beneath them. When movement becomes dependent on a centralized system, the system itself acquires a quiet leverage. What makes this shift particularly difficult to perceive is its gradual nature. There is no singular moment when the old system disappears. Instead, it is layered over, adjusted, and eventually absorbed. The caravan does not vanish. It becomes irrelevant. The informal route is not erased. It is bypassed. Over time, what once defined the region's logic fades into the background, replaced by something that feels more modern but is, in essence, more controlled.
Observers often focus on the visible markers, investment figures, construction milestones, geopolitical announcements. These are easier to measure, easier to discuss.
But they are not where the deeper change resides. The real transformation occurs in the alignment of incentives, in the quiet redirection of flows that determines how people, goods, and decisions move through space. It is here, in this alignment, that the desert begins to lose its unpredictability. And in losing that unpredictability, it also loses a form of resilience that had been built over centuries. Systems that rely on centralized control tend to function with remarkable efficiency, but they also introduce a different kind of fragility, one that does not reveal itself until the system is placed under stress. For now, the movement continues. The trucks follow their routes. The infrastructure expands. The language used to describe it remains focused on growth, connectivity, and opportunity. Yet beneath this language, a quieter pattern is forming, one that has appeared before in different forms, in different places. It begins with movement becoming measurable, and it rarely ends there. The moment movement becomes measurable, it also becomes governable. What was once negotiated through countless local arrangements begins to align under a single framework, one that can be adjusted not through dialogue, but through policy, pricing, and access. This is where infrastructure shifts from being a passive facilitator to an active instrument of power. State-controlled systems often emerge under the language of coordination. They promise to reduce inefficiencies, to eliminate redundancies, to bring order to what appears fragmented. In many cases, they succeed. Flows become faster, costs decline, unpredictability is reduced. But these outcomes are not neutral. They depend on a reorganization of incentives that gradually draws activity toward the center. As routes consolidate, so does dependence. Merchants who once relied on multiple paths begin to favor the one that guarantees speed and reliability. Smaller networks, unable to compete with the scale and support of centralized infrastructure, begin to wither.
Over time, the system simplifies itself, not by removing complexity entirely, but by channeling it into fewer, more controlled nodes.
This pattern has appeared in different eras, though often under different names. In imperial systems, roads and trade corridors were maintained not only to facilitate commerce, but to ensure that economic activity remained legible to the center. Taxation, security, and governance all became easier when flows were predictable. The system, in effect, began to see its own territory more clearly. But clarity comes with a cost. When activity concentrates, so does risk. A dispersed network absorbs shocks unevenly. Disruptions in one area are often offset by stability in another. A centralized system, by contrast, becomes more efficient precisely because it reduces redundancy. What appears as optimization is, in structural terms, a narrowing of pathways. In the present case, the transformation of desert routes into a coordinated artery follows this same logic. Investment on the scale of $10 billion does not merely enhance existing flows, it reshapes them. It signals that certain routes will be prioritized, certain regions integrated, and others, by implication, left peripheral. The geography of movement becomes less organic and more intentional. Numbers, when they appear, tend to reinforce this perception of inevitability. Increased throughput, reduced transit times, expanded capacity. These metrics suggest progress, and in many ways, they are accurate. Yet they also conceal the degree to which the system is becoming dependent on its own continuity. The more efficient it becomes, the less tolerant it is of interruption. Historical parallels rarely announce themselves in identical form, but the underlying mechanisms remained consistent. When the Ottoman Empire invested in its trade routes, it strengthened its ability to manage vast territories, but it also tied its stability to the uninterrupted functioning of those routes. When disruptions occurred, whether through conflict, shifting trade patterns, or internal strain, the effects were not isolated. They propagated through the system, revealing dependencies that had previously gone unnoticed. Similarly, in more modern centralized economies, the drive toward coordination has often produced impressive short-term gains. Infrastructure projects, state-directed investment, and integrated logistics networks create the appearance of cohesion. Yet beneath this cohesion lies a structural tension. The system must continue to function at scale because its components are no longer designed to operate independently. This is where fragility begins to take shape, though it does so quietly. It is not the kind of fragility that announces itself through immediate failure. Instead, it accumulates in the background, in the alignment of incentives that discourages deviation.
When all flows are directed through the same channels, alternatives diminish. Flexibility is replaced by consistency, and consistency, while efficient, can become brittle under pressure.
In the desert, this shift is particularly significant because it represents a departure from a long-standing pattern of distributed resilience. The older systems were slower, less predictable, and often less efficient, but they were also adaptable. They could reroute, renegotiate, and reconfigure in response to changing conditions. Their strength lay in their dispersion. The new system, by contrast, derives its strength from concentration. It is designed to function as a unified whole where each component supports the others. This design allows for scale, but it also creates a dependency on coordination. If one part falters, the effects are not contained. They ripple outward, affecting the entire structure. What is emerging then is not merely a new route across the desert, but a new logic governing movement itself. It reflects a broader pattern in which states seek to bring complexity under control, to replace informal networks with formal systems, and to align economic activity with centralized oversight.
This pattern does not imply failure. In many cases, it leads to periods of stability and growth, but it does suggest a particular trajectory, one in which the system becomes increasingly reliant on its own structure.
And as that reliance deepens, so too does the potential for disruption when the structure is tested. For now, the system continues to expand, its efficiency reinforcing the decisions that created it. The flows it generates appear to validate its design. Yet the pattern, once recognized, begins to reveal its own contours. It is not the presence of control that defines it. It is the accumulation of dependence. Dependence rarely announces itself as a turning point. It accumulates gradually, embedding itself into routines, expectations, and assumptions about continuity. By the time it becomes visible, it is no longer a condition that can be easily reversed. It has already shaped behavior, reorganized institutions, and narrowed the range of responses available when conditions begin to shift.
In centralized systems, this accumulation often creates a particular rhythm. For extended periods, the system appears stable, even resilient.
Disruptions occur, but they are absorbed. Adjustments are made. The machinery continues to function, reinforcing the belief that the structure is sound. It is during this phase that confidence deepens, not only among those who manage the system, but among those who depend on it. The desert artery, now defined by its scale and precision, enters this phase quietly. Movement becomes routine. Timelines are met. Economic activity aligns itself with the expectations set by the infrastructure. Regions that were once peripheral begin to orient themselves around the new routes, while older patterns of movement fade further into obscurity. The system does not need to assert its dominance. It is expressed through its normal operation. Yet this normality carries within it a subtle tension. The more the system succeeds, the more it encourages behavior that assumes its continued success. Businesses plan around its reliability. Governments integrate it into broader strategies. Individuals, whether consciously or not, begin to depend on its presence. Alternatives, already diminished, become increasingly impractical. This is the stage at which fragility becomes most difficult to perceive. It is not visible in the performance of the system, which remains strong, but in the absence of fallback options. What once existed as multiple pathways has been consolidated into a primary route. Efficiency has replaced redundancy, and with it, the capacity to absorb unexpected strain without systemic consequences. History suggests that when stress does emerge, it does not always originate from within the system itself. External factors, shifts in trade patterns, geopolitical tensions, technological changes, interact with the system in ways that are difficult to anticipate. Because the structure is optimized for a particular set of conditions, it can struggle to adapt when those conditions evolve. When such moments arrive, they are often misunderstood at first. Early signs of strain appear as isolated disruptions, manageable within the existing framework.
Adjustments are made, resources are redirected, confidence is maintained. The system continues to function, though with increasing effort.
It is only when these disruptions begin to align, when they affect multiple components simultaneously, that the underlying dependencies become apparent. At that point, the transition from stability to instability can feel abrupt, even though the conditions that made it possible have been present for some time. What changes is not the existence of fragility, but its visibility. The system, once taken for granted, becomes the focus of attention. Its complexity no longer a source of strength, but a challenge to manage. For those within the system, the experience is rarely dramatic in a single moment. It unfolds through adjustments, delays that were once unthinkable becoming acceptable, contingencies that were once unnecessary becoming routine. Institutions adapt as best they can, but their responses are shaped by the very structure that constrains them. Flexibility, having been reduced in the pursuit of efficiency, is difficult to restore quickly. In the context of the desert, the consequences extend beyond infrastructure. They touch the social and economic patterns that have reorganized themselves around the new artery. Communities that aligned with its flows may find themselves exposed when those flows are disrupted. Regions that were integrated into the system may experience the effects of strain not as isolated events, but as part of a broader shift that alters their position within the network. There is no singular outcome that defines such transitions. Some systems adapt, finding ways to reintroduce flexibility or to redistribute flows. Others experience more pronounced disruptions, their centralized structures amplifying the effects of stress. The distinction often depends on factors that are not immediately visible: how decisions are made, how information circulates, how quickly adjustments can be implemented without destabilizing the whole. What remains consistent is the pattern itself. Centralization brings clarity, efficiency, and scale. It also brings a reliance on continuity that can become a source of vulnerability. The transformation of caravan routes into a multi-billion-dollar artery reflects this duality. It is both an achievement of coordination and a redefinition of dependence. In the end, the desert does not resist change. It absorbs it, reshaping its own logic in response. But the systems imposed upon it carry their own histories, their own patterns of emergence and strain. They follow trajectories that have been traced before, even if the details differ. The routes are faster now, the distances feel shorter, the movement is precise, and the structure beneath it all has become something that must continue to function, not because it always has, but because so much now depends on it.